My title is a kind of pun, really, and I think you'll see why at the end, in terms of the virtual world in terms of the internet, but it also really referring to the fact that we live in a virtual world inside our own minds, and that's actually critical to this whole enterprise. But I hope it will also illustrate the benefits of drawing on many different fields. So I have a very checkered background. Eventually, when I retire, I hope I will have discovered what discipline I belong to. But this is a source of great confusion for me at the moment, and always has been. But it's partly because in trying to understand what's going on in the nature of networks and sociality, we've ended up being pushed to collaborate with people at one end in sort of psychology and neuroimaging, and at the other end, the physicists who've captured the world of networks, and via biology in between, really, or at least ecology. All right, so I'm going to phrase my starting point, really, in terms of the promissory note that was made when Facebook first started. And the promissory note was, here's a new technology which is going to open up a whole new wonderful social vista for you. You're going to be able to have hundreds of thousands of friends all over the world with whom you're going to communicate in this virtual environment. And the question I am going to pose for you and then try and answer is, have they lived up to the promissory note on the tin can? Has Facebook opened up? And I know you're all on Facebook. I'm sure. Yeah, Kimmo is. That means everybody. Has it really changed the social world you live in? And the answer I'm going to tell you is no, absolutely not. And it hasn't changed it, and this will be what I'll try and show or convince you, because our psychology really isn't designed to handle anything on that scale. But these are just two bits of casual data, basically from Facebook themselves. So up there, an analysis by Stephen Wolfram recently of 1 million Facebook pages, the number of friends that people have on Facebook. And yes, there are a few people that have 5,000 Facebook friends, which is the limit they'll allow, but you can see this is a very left-biased distribution. There's a very strong modal peak up there, somewhere around about 200. So that's the sort of average. And these are some of Cameron Marlowe's analyses of Facebook data. He's one of the in-house sociologists. I think he's at MIT or Harvard, one of the two, but he is one of their in-house sociologists on Facebook. And he's simply looking at the traffic that's going on within Facebook in terms of the size of the Facebook owners' network, as it were. So he's split them up into small networks, 50 friends, 150 friends, 500 friends, and then try to look at the kind of nature of strong relationships, if you like, as defined by traffic. So this is 3 different ways. The 3 columns in each case are just 3 different ways of trying to identify the heavy traffic that's going on within it, the postings. Pink's the girls, blue's the boys. And the bottom line here is, even though the number of friends that you have on Facebook increases by an order of magnitude, most of the traffic that users have is with a very, very small number, and that only changes by a factor of about 3 across that huge gap. So here's some evidence, if you like, that actually, despite what the technology will allow you to do, the reality is we still live in a very small-scale virtual world. And here's perhaps one of the reasons for that. This is essentially a diary study we did, looking at people's satisfaction with individual interactions with their 5, I think it was, closest friends over a period of several weeks. At the end of the day, they rated each of the interactions they'd had on a happiness scale, a general satisfaction scale, contentedness scale with that interaction, and as a function of the media that was involved. So on the left there, face-to-face, Skype, phone, instant messaging, texting, or email, and social networking sites. We didn't distinguish between those two. But the burden of this is how different the experience you have is in face-to-face, and as it turns out, Skype interactions. That was quite surprising to us. We hadn't expected Skype to be so effective, given how clunky it is still, compared with the other media, all of which are single channel, and especially the text media on the right-hand side. There's something very different to these. Well, the key difference, obviously, is you feel that you're in the same room with Skype. That's the whole point. You feel that you're what the psychologists refer to as co-presence with the other people. But also, I think you're getting a much richer feedback. So you're getting multi-channel feedback. You can see the smile breaking on the other person's face as you tell the joke, whereas with text-based things, messaging, you don't get that kind of feedback. And that makes it much richer and therefore a more pleasurable experience. But there is another aspect of it, and that turns out to be laughter. So here in the middle is just the frequency of laughter on those same things. You can see it's much higher on face-to-face and Skype. The text-based ones are the use of emoticons and LOLs and things like that, virtual laughter, if you like. Much more laughter going on, and here's the consequence of that. If you then look at these data from up there on happiness ratings as a function of whether or not there was laughter in that particular interaction, so we've got the same channels, as it were, but up on the top, interactions, the happiness ratings for interactions during which laughter occurred and those where there was no laughter. It's massively, significantly different. There's something about laughter that's very important in the process of creating interactions and therefore relationships. So the question is, why doesn't Facebook or any of the other media really work better? Why doesn't it allow us to have more bigger networks? The answer comes really largely from the social brain hypothesis. There's an explanation for why primates have bigger brains than all other vertebrates, actually. Bigger brains for body size, but also by and large, absolutely bigger brains. And the suggestion is because they live in very complex societies compared to much more complex societies than other taxa, and therefore they need a bigger computer to manage this dynamic complexity that they have. And some of the evidence to support that comes from these data, which is plotting a very simple measure of social complexity, namely group size. At least that reflects the number of dyads you have to manage. Plotting against some measure of brain size. It turns out not to matter particularly what measure of brain size you do, but absolute frontal lobe volume turns out to give you much, much cleaner results. But pretty much anything else will do, and you get these nice grade differences, essentially reflecting increasing sociocognitive complexity as you go from left to right, with the apes out here on the right. And if you plug humans in there, humans are available, as it happens, in the same database. You get this predicted value of about 150 that's now known as Dunbar's number, which, just for the record, was named Dunbar's number on Facebook, of all places. Anyway, the issue is how real is that prediction? Is it the case that humans' social world really consists of these very small units? These are just a little sort of set of compilation of the data, some casual observations on the right-hand side, left-hand side over there of natural groupings that occur in the scattered historical and sociological and archaeological and business literature that fall within the confidence intervals for that prediction of 150, which, because of the scaling effects, are actually from 100 to 200. I'm kind of... Now, I might just comment on a couple, actually. I mean, one is, yes, modern armies in there. Modern armies turn out to use these numbers. They're all built around these numbers that I'll come to show you. The other one is Gore-Tex. One of it is claimed in the business literature anyway, that one of the secrets of Gore-Tex, its success as essentially a medium-sized, very, very successful company, is its management structure. It doesn't have a hierarchical management structure. It has what they call a flat lattice management structure. That's to say, they have a family board that runs it, but underneath it you have independent factories. No factory is allowed to consist of more than 200 individuals. Most of them are about 150. And often these factories are sitting on the same site, on the parking lot next door. So when they've increased in size, the business, instead of building a bigger and bigger factory, what they've done is just build a new factory next door. It's a very self-contained factory. You then don't have to have management structures. There's no management hierarchy inside the factory, no formal management hierarchy, but everybody knows everybody else and what their role is. And you get much greater integration and cohesion and cooperation as a result of that. And it's one of the suggestions as to why they've been so successful. And here are 3 examples of data that essentially point in the same direction. These are 2 of our data sets. This is ethnographic data on census data from tribal societies, which are very, tribal societies like our societies are hierarchically organized, hierarchical layers. It's that red layer there. There's the blue is the predicted value of 150. The red dotted lines are the confidence intervals around that prediction. That layer of grouping fits very nicely in that. None of the other layers, which are all well known, do so. And here, this is sort of looking top down on how the population is distributed in space, if you like. These data down here, the Christmas card data, are looking at the same problem, but bottom up from the individual. And here, this is sort of simply asking, how many people do you think are there in the receiving households of all the Christmas cards you send at Christmas? And the answer is a lot of variability. There's Kimmo over here at the top end, sending it to about 300 people or so because he's very sociable and he knows lots and lots of people. There's me down at this end who doesn't know anybody and has no friends and so on. So there's a big range there, but that's kind of interesting. We'll come back to that. But the point is that it's a very peak distribution on the whole, and the means for all 3 of these really cluster very nicely around 150. So if you like, there's some quantitative evidence. But this is probably my favorite proof of 2 things, not only that humans live in groups of 150, but also of a general principle of evolution. So this is a Dutch girl who had some of you may know this story, my apologies, but I just think it's lovely. She had all the faces of her friends tattooed on her right arm. And it's a major triumph of evolution that the human arm is just long enough to take 152 friends, right? What more proof do you need? Well, actually, it's proof of something else which is even more interesting, is that Dutch tattoo artists read the scientific literature because it turns out to be a hoax. You can go and see her do it, supposedly tattooing it on YouTube. You can see her actually doing it, supposedly. But in fact, these are transfers. So somewhere she'd read this story about humans being limited to 150 and used it in a rather fun way. But there's a kind of interesting message here, because if she really had her friends' faces tattooed, that in about 5 years' time would have been a serious problem, because probably about 1/3 of those would have no longer be her friends. So this is, do you want to carry people you no longer like, their faces forever on your arm? Luckily, they're transfers. All right, so if we look at the structure of our networks, they kind of don't look like that. They're not homogeneous. They look much more like this. They're clumpy. And if you look at actual data on the network, so this is we've tried to put together, since those original data sets, a number of data sets of people's complete social networks. So we make them just sit them down and say, right, everybody who you think is in your network. Enormously long questionnaires that take about 2 hours to fill in. And one of the things we asked them to do is to specify for every single individual when they last saw them, how many months ago. So that's the y-axis there, which is going from 0 to 8 months up there. That's the time since you last saw them or last contacted them. And also, how emotionally close do you feel to them on a very simple 1 to 10 scale. It turns out that simple measure correlates with almost every measure of emotional closeness and social closeness and friendship that social psychologists have tried to develop. It's very simple to do. And it works extremely well. But the point is, you can see this nice negative relationship. The people you love most dearly you rank them 10, or give them a rating of 10, you see most often, you see those yesterday, and then the people you're kind of neutral about, this is not negative, 0 is not negative, it's just completely neutral, those you see less often. But I think if you look at it, you get a kind of sense that there are kind of layers in there somehow. There's a sort of intuitive feel. So this prompted us to look at these data in much more detail. So we've basically used the maths of fractals here to look for recurring patterns in the data. On this side, this is our ethnographic database that I showed you before with the layers in it. And this is our Christmas card database here. And basically, the peaks here, which identify the fractal parameters, when you convert them back into what they mean in the real world down here, give you a scaling ratio of almost exactly 3. And then some guys who are now at Santa Fe, Marcus Hamilton's now at Santa Fe, did a similar analysis they didn't know about what we'd just done on hunter-gatherer grouping sizes. They did in a slightly different way. They used a Horton order analysis, which is much simpler. This practically blocked up the UCLA mainframe computer for a week as far as I can make out. This is stupidly complex. The penalty of getting physicists to do things for you. This was done on the back of an envelope. Gives you the same answer. Actually, they got 4, very close to 4. This is a kind of interesting observation. They got a slope. The slope gives you the scaling parameter, right? So this is plotting, in their case, group size or at different layers. You identify the layers first. Here, the layers are being identified by the analysis, of course. They identify the layers first, and then they look at the group sizes or the group frequency. And the slope then gives you the scaling parameter. But it turns out, because they included the individual as layer 1, so they anchored it at the individual, this pulls the left hand down and gives you a steeper slope. If you take the individual out, you get exactly the same scaling ratio as we get from those data. And it turns out we use that Horton order procedure for looking at scaling in mammalian complex social systems, so primates, orcas, the killer whales, elephants, who show this similar multi-level type society, and you get exactly the same scaling ratios, almost exactly 3 in their case too. We have absolutely no idea why. However, we will come back to that. But what it means for you is you sit in the center of a series of expanding circles, rather like the ripples on a pond. There you are, the stone in the center, the ripples going out. The layers increase by a factor of 3. Each layer is inclusive of the layers within it, so the 15 includes the 5. It goes right out to 150, and we know from our data there are 2 more layers out beyond that, one at 500, one at 1500. Now, the military use those. If you look at modern armies, they have exactly that structure with those numbers. They just keep going in multiples of 3. So they go out to 5,000, 15,000, 50,000. They're standard sizes. They vary a little bit from country to country, but the averages just follow those lines completely. The center circle is an Al-Qaeda bombing unit or a special services unit. But just to give you a sense of the fact that as you go out through these layers, yes, you include more people, but the quality of the relationship declines. And this is using just the contact rates per day from our data to show you how a huge amount of your social time is invested. That's per individual. Invested in those first 2 inner circles. So something like 60% of your total social capital, in effect, however you measure that, is invested in 15 people, and the other 40% in the other 135 out to your 150. All right. It turns out that you can pick these signatures up again in Facebook. So these are data that Andrea Passarella at Pisa that we collaborate with, another group of lost physicists looking for a project. Essentially. They had access to this quite old now Facebook data set and did a rather nice analysis. What they did was look to see whether you could identify clusters and what the optimal number of clusters you would get out of these data sets. These are quite early data sets. Remember, they're for teenagers, so they're not running to the full 150. They get a very clearly up there an optimal number of clusters explaining the data distributions in terms of the postings, in terms of 4 clusters. And when you look at the sizes of these clusters, they're replicating beautifully these same numbers. But notice this little inner core here of some layer round about, in this case, 1.8 individuals that we hadn't picked up. Well, I'll come back to that. This is a follow-up paper by one of their PhD students looking at Twitter, or looking at Twitterati. So that's people following talking to each other as followers of a Twitter account, as it were, and doing a similar kind of analysis and picking up these layers again. So again, we're getting they're doing it only on Twitter accounts that are people's Twitter accounts rather than sort of multinationals type Twitter accounts, which is all the top graph shows. But again, they're picking up 4 key layers, and again, you're getting numbers very much in the same area. And again, C1, that very inner core of a very small number of people, around about 1.5 people who seem to occupy an awful lot of your time. And we thought about this quite a long time actually, because we'd noticed in this scaling ratio, so this is the sizes of the layers as we have them, the 5, 15, 50, 150, 500, this nice linear layer. If you think about it, there's a layer missing. And there's a layer missing right there, right? So if you extrapolate downwards, you should actually have an inner layer at 1.5, which is exactly what they've showed in the Facebook and the Twitter data, which is really very nice. Who are these 1.5, you may ask? Well, it turns out they're probably girls' girlfriends, predominantly. So other work we've done, this has been done on Facebook, looking at profile pictures as a measure of social affinity, if you like. And essentially what it's showing is that if girls have a photograph of themselves and one other person in it who isn't obviously their mother or their child, it's likely to be a same-age girlfriend, or a parent maybe, and not a boyfriend as it was. It's likely to be a same-age girlfriend. And that's extremely rare for boys. That's assuming boys don't have their Nike shoes, which a surprising number of people have as their Facebook profile page, or very large motorbikes, which appears to be the other. But if they don't, they're much more likely to have a group of guys. And what we think is going on here is that girls have an inner layer of very intense relationships, which will typically consist both of a boyfriend and a best girlfriend. And those two relationships are kind of very tight, very close, and they create, if you like, an inner layer for girls of about 2. And boys don't have that. They'll have their girlfriend on there, but never, ever another, almost never another bloke, unless they happen to be gay, perhaps. That would be the only exception. If they're going to have blokes at all in there, it's going to be a group, and typically it's a group of about 4 or 5. So guys don't really have this inner layer, and if they have it at all, it's a girlfriend and a romantic partner, let's say, and it's just 1. So the 1.5 is coming out at the average between those two. So that's probably what's explaining that. All right. So friendships. Actually, I should say, preface this with just the observation that your social network consists of really 2 networks that are interdigitated: a family network, a kinship network, and a friendship network, i.e. people who are not biologically related to you. And these are absolutely locked together. Each layer consists of about half and half. And overall, on average, even in modern Europe, and our data are 50% from Britain, 50% from Belgium, the big network sample we have, about half of your social network, on average, is family. So family is still very important. That's extended family, going out a long way. Secondarily, if you come from a large family, we prioritize family members so much in our networks, it squeezes out friends. So people who come from large extended families have small numbers of friends. You can see this very, very clearly in our data. They have very different dynamics. Family networks don't change. You can abuse your family members and they still love you, apparently, and or you still love them. But that doesn't happen with friends. If you don't see friends, quality of the relationship deteriorates very rapidly. So these are data from an 18-month study we did. following people after they moved away from home, went to university. This is their mean emotional closeness to the original set of friends they had at the start of the study back at home. And you can see it's falling away very, very fast, even within, they're not going to university till about 6 months in. So even within that short space of time when they're not seeing these friends anymore, the quality of that relationship is deteriorating extremely quickly. And that's a time effect. They're not investing time in them. And I'll just illustrate how important time is in your relationships with this. This is a very big sample of the number of people in your inner core of relationships, which is defined as the number of people you would go to for emotional and social and any other economic support. It's not defined on a time or a number basis. They can put as many people in as they like. You end up with this number at about 5, lots of variance around it. Now, it just so happened by chance, we didn't intend to. I got quite cross with the postdoc when he showed me the data and said, why did you ask this stupid question about romantic relationships for? We didn't need to know that. Well, it turned out to be a stroke of genius, because when we separated the data out, it turned out the people in active romantic relationships only have 4 in that inner circle, not 5. And that's a reflection of how costly romantic relationships are for you, because if you think about it, what's happening, you don't fall in love with somebody who's already in your inner core of 5, right? Not least because 2 of those are your mum and your dad, or your brother and your sister, and they're not the people you usually have as a romantic partner, so that excludes a lot of them. You usually fall in love with somebody who comes in from outside your 150, and you bring them into the center of the circle, you've now got 6, and you've reduced it to 4. So you've sacrificed 2 inner core friends, 2 best friends in the Facebook sense, for this one person. I sincerely hope he's or she is worth it. What's more, it's kind of interesting if you think about who are they sacrificing, right? Now you've got 2 choices, because that inner core of 5 consists of 2 family members, 2 close family members, 2 very good friends, and kind of one or other to make up the numbers. So you could sacrifice your family members and keep your friends, but that's kind of, it's a bit tricky really, although family relationships are quite robust to not investment, lack of investment, still you depend on these people for the whole of your life. You know, you can't really afford to sacrifice them that much. So the alternative is you sacrifice your 2 friends. If you sacrifice your 2 friends, this is perhaps even a more serious problem, because when your boyfriend finally dumps you and you go along to your family members and sort of say, you know, give me emotional support, I'm a wreck, they kind of go, what do you mean? There are plenty more out there. Get a grip, find somebody else, and we never liked him anyway. Right? Whereas you need somebody independent of that who has a shoulder to cry on. So it turns out that what you sacrifice is 1 family member and 1 friend. You keep 1 of each. Unbelievably subtle. How clever is that? Just amazing. Still, okay. Here's a bit of data from that we've been doing with the group here in Bex, mostly the hard work of Yari, really, as much as anybody else. But this turned out to be really quite extraordinary. So this is looking at these phone call data again, and looking at the patterns of contact frequency. And it turns out you get exactly the same story. These are data, and the main core of the analysis is on the frequency of calling. So what we had was, we followed these people through 18 months, but we wanted to know what causes relationships to decline and how do they use technology to reduce the rate of decline. So mainly interested in phones. We have all their phone records of who they're calling, and we know who everybody is because they tell us. That's part of the deal, right? So, and we have these 3 waves of questionnaire data on telling us, you know, sort of emotional closeness and what they've done with people and so on. What we've done here essentially is to just look at the frequency distribution of call ratings. I'm sorry, what I was in the process of saying was it turns out that the frequency that you call, how long you spend in total, the total duration of calling, the frequency of face-to-face contact, which we have from the questionnaires, and the emotional closeness all correlate very closely, give us the same story. But the key issue, here's 2 key points that come out of this. One is that everybody has an almost unique signature of their social investment patterns. It's as though you have a kind of style which creates the order in which you rank people and how much time you invest in them. And that, more importantly, that signature is extraordinarily stable over time, doesn't change very much, even though there's very high turnover. So the Jacquard indices here simply show the amount of turnover. It's the inverse of turnover. The lower it is, more turnover in the two phases, so from 0 to 9 months to 18 months. There's a significant amount of turnover in the membership of the networks for individuals. And here's just the three phases of, if you like, first 6 months, middle 6 months, last 6 months, in the structure of these, of two male networks. But they're all pretty similar. The yellow dashed line is the average across everybody. But you can see the patterns are remaining really extraordinarily similar for each of these two individuals across this time frame, despite very considerable turnover in network membership. And this is only looking at the top 20 spaces. So the actual signature is as many people as they have in it, 80 or whatever it is. Even in the top ranks, there's high turnover. It does raise the question of how you prevent relationships decaying like that. This was also kind of a surprise because it highlighted a sex difference in how relationships are managed, which I think goes back to the nature of male and female close social relationships that I talked about earlier. So we have two different sets of data. One is how often they essentially talk to each other. These are the questionnaire data. So this is the contact frequency. And over here, they also told us what they had done with each of these people, a series of activities, going shopping together, going to parties together, going on holiday together, or what have you. And they're rating them. And what's plotted here is the change in emotional closeness between the beginning and the end of the study for those who spent less time on the left-hand side or did fewer of these activities with that person or more as it were, at the end than they did at the beginning. And the burden of these stories is that really that to slow down the rate of decay on relationships requires work. You either have to do stuff or you have to talk to them. But the really interesting feature is the difference between the two sexes here. It's clear that what really slows down girls' relationship decay is talking together, whereas that has very little effect on boys' relationships. A flat line at the top. Whereas what really affects boys' relationships is doing stuff together, banging heads together in the woods. I don't know what boys do. You can have a census afterwards, we'll see. But it looks like the mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms that they use to manage and service their relationships are really very, very different. And these, of course, are much more intimate. This is perhaps why girls' relationships are much more intimate than boys' relationships are. But it also goes back to the fact that boys really like clubs. So tend to have these clusters of 4 blokes. But what's interesting about those, girls' relationships, if you move away to another town, you're on the phone all the time or on Facebook, checking up with each other, keeping in contact. When that happens to boys, they move to another town, they forget the guys back home. They just find a new group of 4 boys, start again. They can come back and sort of see the old guys again, maybe, and pick up where they left off. But it's a much more casual sort of social world. All right. So the question is, what is it that's underpinning the nature of these relationships? We've come to the conclusion that, as in all primates, relationships are created, really, by a 2-process mechanism. There's a very intense, emotionally intense component, which is built off the back of this stuff, grooming, which primates do a lot of, and then there's a cognitive component. So this is a kind of psychopharmacological mechanism which enables 2 animals to spend a lot of time together, off the back of which they can then build a relationship of kind of trust and reciprocity and obligation, which then involves the sort of social brain component of it. And I'm going to quickly go through those, but just to put the context on that, this is really the key data showing the importance of grooming. So it's an experiment done a long time ago now by Barry Cavern in Cambridge, showing that if you inject very, very small doses of morphine into monkeys and then measure their interest in grooming, here it's just the number of grooming partners they have, ones with a morphine injection, these are so small you couldn't detect them in the blood. You couldn't detect the chemicals in the blood. Just lose interest in grooming compared to a saline control. And then if you do the reverse, which is injecting naltrexone, opiate blocker, which locks onto the opiate sites in the brain, the opioid sites, receptor sites in the brain, blocks them, so the opioids can't get in there, then the animals are much more desperate to have grooming than those which have the saline control. And what this is pointing to is the key role that beta endorphins in particular, which naltrexone is the antagonist for, in the process of creating this emotionally bonded relation, the emotional component to these close relationships. So this is, it's an opioid, it acts just like morphine and other natural or unnatural, depending on how you like to look at it, opiates, in that it makes you feel contented and slightly euphoric and at peace with the world and very happy with the people you're interacting with right now. The only difference is the endorphins are produced by the brain. They're part of the pain control system, and they manage essentially pain in the way that opiates exactly do. We know that from masses and masses of pain research, but they have this critically important relationship in primate social bonding, and probably only primate social bonding. Just to show you some more Helsinki stuff, this is the first pilot results really from a PET scanning study which is being run at Turku by Lauri, looking to pick up endorphins in the brain in response to light touch. So this is really in response just to very light stroking. You're getting massive endorphin activation in the brain, which is exactly what grooming is all about. Grooming is, I used to think it was about pain, and it was a bit like massage. But it's become apparent that the mammals have this peculiar, unique set of afferent nerves from the skin to the brain, the C fibers, which only respond to light stroking. And that's what grooming is all about. So a lot of leafing going on as you stroke the fur when you're grooming. And here we are, we see it in humans. Okay, so that's the kind of mechanisms component, as it were. The cognition is briefly sketch out that. It really comes down to this stuff, which is known as intentionality or mentalizing in the psychological literature. This ability to believe that something is the case, to have mind states that involve beliefs about the world. So Jack here is in first order intentionality. He has a belief about the world. These intentionality layers form a natural recursive hierarchical sequence, or recursive sequence rather. Jill here is in second order. She believes that Jack believes something is the case. Jack is in third order here and just goes on forever. In fact, it turns out that the norm for adult humans, a huge amount of work has been done on this middle layer here, second order, but kids do that at 5. That's not very clever stuff. You know. Great apes can just about do that too. What's really interesting is how much adult humans can do, and that's pretty much what you do every day of your life, or at least you can do. 5 orders of intentionality, the intentional terms, the belief states are the ones that are underlined. And here's the data for that, one of several studies we've done now, trying to define really the range of these competencies. And you can see, I wouldn't get too excited about the first and second order and the 8th and 9th. Those are probably artifacts as much as anything. But in between, you've got a big variation in individuals, but a nice peak at 5th order, and that's in all our data sets. And then with that same group of people, we asked them to tell us how many people are in their inner circles of their network. When you plot the two together, you get a very significant relationship. It's very messy. Some of that's due to sex differences. Girls are better on these tasks than boys, and they have bigger network sizes on the inner core, particularly than boys do, but not massively so, but with large samples significantly so. And there's some personality, quite strong personality effects in there. But even without worrying about those confounds, there's a significant relationship, and we've replicated that again several times. Well, what you have here, if you think about it, is you've got some software up there, cognition, you've got some hardware, output here, behavioral output, clique size, and something is going on in the brain. So the question is there a three-way relationship here between the hardware, the brain, the software, the cognition, and the behavior, clique size? And that sent us off to do a load of imaging studies, and the answer turns out to be yes. These are a summary of several different neuroimaging studies, a grosser stereological analysis up there, which shows simply that the best predictor of both your mentalizing competences as an individual and your clique size, social network size, and remember, because the layers are so tightly scaled, you can measure any layer, you can predict any other layer, correlate with the orbital frontal cortex, this bit here, which is the last bit of the brain really to evolve in primates. This part is actually unique to anthropoid primates. It doesn't occur in prosimians, for example, or other mammals. It's what allows primates, anthropoid primates, to do a number of things that other animals can't do. That is, principally make one-trial learning effects, because they can make forecasts rather than learning by association. So rather than being inductive scientists, if you like, and just accumulating data and finding generalizations, they become deductive scientists. They can take one observation and make an inference about a rule from it. They can project into the future 2 videotapes of what's going to happen and decide on the best outcome between those two. It's absolutely critical, that area too, in the inhibition of short-term reward interests, as it were. In other words, it allows you to hold back from grabbing the big cake right now in order to get an even bigger cake in the future. What's known in psychology is the inhibition of prepotent responses. And that's what that frontal area is all about. And as I say, it evolved last in primates. The brain evolves from back to front. It develops last. It's the last part of the brain to myelinate, and it doesn't myelinate until you're in your early 20s. And this is a voxel-based morphometry study showing essentially exactly the same thing. Up here in this sort of area, just up here in the frontal, orbital frontal cortex, is where these two capacities come together. And we know from the data we can use the data on the stereological analysis to do a path analysis, which tells us that the causal sequence goes most plausibly from the hardware to the software to the behavior. So the size of your orbital frontal cortex determines your intentionality competences, and it's those that then determine network size, and not the other way around, as it were. Humor is a very important part of this, and I raise this now because I'm going to come back to it in a minute. And I just want to point out that contrary to what we probably think, the average size of laughter groups is very small. So this is a sample of people mostly in pubs, quite a large sample, looking at the size of conversation groups and laughter groups against the number of people basically in the social group sitting at the same table. And you can see that even though group size goes on and on and on, the size of both of these asymptotes at around sort of 3.5 to 4. If anything, laughter groups are rather smaller, suggesting that laughter groups are very small and intimate. So just hang on to that, and we'll come back to it, because it becomes very important in the context of this problem here, which if you go back to the grooming bit in primates, and you plot social time against group size in primates, these are species averages, the amount of time devoted to social grooming against group size for a species, you get this sort of more or less linear relationship, which asymptotes here at about 20%. So these very, very social species are spending 1/5 of their day in this activity. Just think of all the opiates you're getting. You know, you're off your rocker by that stage. But if you plug humans into it, with our groups of 150, if we were to use this mechanism for bonding, proportionately, we would have to devote about 45% of the time. Incidentally, just because there's an increase in grooming time doesn't mean you're grooming with more animals. It's incredibly subtle. What's happening is, as they increase grooming time, they actually decrease the number of animals they groom with. So they're focusing increasingly on the small core alliance that sits at the center of their network, and that protects them from the stresses of living in the group. So the bigger the group gets, the more important that core alliance becomes, and the more time they invest into it. But essentially, we would have to spend a huge amount of time to match them. It turns out, if you look at, these are data on, for humans, the average for about 7 studies, time budgeting studies of modern human populations, and we spend about 20%, almost exactly 20% of our time engaged in social interaction. So it looks like we're using the limiting time available that you find in primates generally. Of course, the rest of it is taken up with food finding, essentially, and resting, essential resting. But we're somehow using that time much more efficiently. What am I doing here? What's this? Oh yes, that's right. Of course, this is time budgeting too. This is simply to point out, this is another big collaborative study we did with the guys in Barcelona at Telefonica. So this is using Telefonica's big database of mobile phone things. There's no secret about that, I don't think. It's looking at the time investment that people make given the size of essentially their phone book, who they're phoning. And the point that's being made here in the top graph is simply that the total amount of time spent on the phone, total cumulative duration, increases up to a point with the size of your network, but then flattens out, and seems to flatten out very decidedly, and it seems to sort of really, starts to sort of turn at about 200. And here you can see this kind of nicely, because if you look at the mean time, so that's cumulative, this is mean time per node, per alter, per contact, you've got this very strong peak at somewhere about 40, or very close to that 50 benchmark. In the amount of time you invest in those individuals. So this is really pointing again to the fact that we're terribly, terribly time constrained. Okay, so there is a solution to this. Grooming, all you want is virtual touch. All right, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to the first person who can invent serious virtual touch that can go on across the internet, I'm sure, because we can all engage in physical grooming, stroking across the entire internet. There have been several attempts to do it. This is one of them. This is the so-called hug that was developed at Carnegie Mellon. It's a bit cumbersome, but you and your granny can have 2 of these at the other end of the internet, and I forget which way around it works, but if you stroke it, the other one heats up, and if you pat it, the other one vibrates. So it's a bit clunky, but it's a start. So here's the challenge, guys. You've got all this money, you've got all this time on your hands. Just invent it, they'll give you the Nobel Peace Prize for sure. As well as the thanks of the dean. But clearly we haven't had those technological benefits. How have we solved the problem? So here's the scale of the problem. This is grooming time predicted off the back of brain size, essentially. So it's just simply taking cranial volume, interpolating through a series of equations, through brain volume, through group size, into grooming time from these regression equations that I showed you, for all our fossil ancestors right back to the earliest ones. And you can see the early Australopithecines, really, they're just kind of great apes. They're sitting nicely on the 20% of time devoted to grooming. It's once you get the appearance of the genus Homo, to which we belong, that things really get seriously bad. That's the bonding gap, as I call it. And we think this is how we solved it, with these 3 activities coming in: laughter, musical performance, particularly singing and dancing, and then the rituals of religion. And they almost certainly came in at these points in time. So we share laughter with great apes, so it's almost certainly the oldest one. It also has many primitive features. One is that very small group size, it has to be face-to-face, and secondly, it's highly contagious. You simply cannot help laughing if you're in a little small conversation group and the others are laughing, even if you don't understand. Even if the joke's in Finnish, you have to laugh. I'm sorry. It's extraordinary, the effect that this has. It just kicks something in that's very primitive. Music and dancing. These three share a lot of similarities. They're full of synchrony. They're full of segmentation. They provide very nicely the precursors to language, and language you need for the top one. Otherwise, there's no reason why you should turn up. All three of those are extremely good producers of endorphins, extremely good producers of endorphin. I'll just show you, we've done a lot of work on dancing and singing and laughter. Now, to show that, I'll just show you the laughter ones. The form we use, we just do what the pain people do, pain research people do. We use pain threshold as a proxy for endorphin activation, do a pain test, do some activity, and then retest the pain threshold. If endorphins have been produced, pain threshold should increase across that manipulation. If there's no change, then there's been no endorphin activation. We've got an intervention, people watching comedy videos against a control. They're watching anything that's incredibly boring. We've done 5, I think we've done 6 altogether. So we show them a video of Michael McIntyre or some comedian, stand-up comedian that works well, and we find something really boring that never makes any people laugh. And the best one is golfing instruction videos. Sorry if you're a golfer, but you never get laughter. And you can see the differences. You know, there's a lot of error variance in this because this is a sort of somewhat subjective measure in the end. But the differences are clear, and you've got these nice significant differences between the experimental and control. So you get really good endorphin production pushing us up. And this raises a possibility, really, that, now that we have these very large, remember, these mechanisms are designed to get us up to 150 only, communities of 150. They're not really designed to get beyond that. And you might think there's an obvious solution here to solving the crises of the EU and preventing the EU falling apart and disbanding. And that's just to get everybody working out down the gym, lots of endorphins. We'd really, love each other and cooperate, and it would be nirvana in Europe. Believe me. There is one problem about this. Yes, you would get an endorphin surge because it's clear that what's driving it is the pain mechanism in these three things. They're all hard work for the body. Laughter, music, singing particularly, rituals that are all actually hard work for the body. And that's what's triggering the endorphin activation. But it's not creating this sense of bondedness. And it's become very clear to us that what the critical thing is, and here's the big sticking point for the internet, I think, that it's really the large-scale cooperation interaction that goes on in social context, social events, that allows this massive effect that produces this larger scale. So what you're doing, in effect, is grooming several individuals at the same time virtually, but you have to be doing it simultaneously to create this sense of a little cluster. And that the core to that was synchrony. It's synchronized activity. Laughter is highly synchronized when people laugh. Music and dancing, singing, obviously so. Rituals of religion, again, obviously so. So this is it was our first attempt to look at this. We've now done it with dance, and we get very nice results from dance, but this was our first attempt. So we took sweep oar rowing, the standard sort of 8-man rowing boats, because the key to that is not the power that these guys generate by rowing together, because they're all professionals at this sort of level. So this is the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. These guys are all professionals. They have immense power. The problem for them is how long can they keep the oars in perfect synchrony? That determines whether you win or lose. Once you start to become ragged and out of synchrony with each other, you lose so much power on the boat. It's absolutely unbelievable. If you've rowed, you will know what I mean. This is the 2007 boat race. I think it was the last boat race Oxford lost. This is an 18-minute course. It takes them 18 minutes to row it. So this is only 5 minutes up the coast. So under a third of the way up the course, Oxford have already lost. Even though they're neck and neck still, they've already lost. You might not be able to see it, but if you look at the first oar on the left-hand side there, his oar is flat. The other oars behind him are vertical. He's out of synchrony with them already. And they've just lost it. From that point on, they just start to fall further and further back. So what we can do is take these guys on their rowing machines. They do 45 minutes of this workout every morning. Then they go out on the river. So you can see how physically tough they are. We have them do their standard 45-minute workout. We do a pain test before and after, and we look at the endorphin increase, and here it is. They did it twice. There's 12 guys in each sample. Well, it's the same 12 guys in all these samples, so it's almost 2 boat crews. We had the first boat and the second boat from Oxford. And then what they did, so these were a week apart, and then on the following day, in each case, they then did this in a virtual boat. So we can link the rowing machines up so that they're rowing in a virtual boat. So they're all in synchrony and stuff. And when you do that, you get this massive uplift. It's a 100% increase in endorphin activation. And that's coming from nothing but social synchrony, because their power output is identical. We can tell that. Little thing on the front of the machine up there is a computer, and it tells them what their power output is. We said row at a constant power output. They're professionals, they could do it. We could measure what their power output was, and we can see that it doesn't vary at all across this. This is purely due to social synchrony. There's a massive increase that's radically ramping up the bonding effect. How we replicate that in internet networking sites, I don't know. But again, this is the second problem for you to solve. Maybe not this 3 years, the next 3 years. Okay. Thank you very much.
The size of the network for those, but there are actually other mammals like caribous which have much larger sets. And even if you go to kind of insects, then you would say that they are millions in one population. And they obviously have to have some other means of bonding than this cognitive bonding, as you would describe it, or something like that. So.
And a very good question that is too. In fact, it turns out that the key here is these, what we refer to as bonded social relationships. And these appear to be pretty much unique to the anthropoid primates, plus a small handful of other mammals that we know of. So the horse family, the whole horse family in particular, the zebras, donkeys, etc., the dolphins, the elephants, they're the only ones that seem to show this same linear relationship between group size and brain size. In all other groups of mammals that we've looked at, there is no such relationship. If you like, the social brain has a slightly different form, and that is the difference between monogamously pair-bonded species and promiscuously mating species, or polygamously mating species. The species with big brains are the ones that are highly pair-bonded. And in birds, you see this very nicely, is that species that are lifelong pair-bonders, like the raptors, the eagles, the crows, have very big brains. The species that are annual pair-bonders, like many of our European garden birds, the robins and tits and so on, that have a new pair, they're in between, and then the promiscuous species are small-brained. And what we think is going on here is that basically, in effect, it's the demands of maintaining a long-term pair-bonded relationships, because it involves a lot of compromise and understanding that in effect, negotiation, if you like, to ensure that the job, which is rearing offspring, is done effectively. You think of birds as most obvious. There's no point if one member of the pair goes and spends the whole of the weekend down in the bird equivalent of the pub getting drunk, because either the one that's left behind starves, and that's not very helpful, or the nestlings starve, or the eggs go cold. So you have to have some kind of way of kind of building a cooperative relationship. And that looks like being cognitively very demanding. What primates and these other handful of species have done has used that same mechanism to create friendships on a larger scale. So not just romantic partnerships, but non-reproductive friendships which are involved in coalitions, essentially coalitionary defense, to maintain these bigger groups. And it looks like you have two strategies in the mammals as to which way you go, primarily as a defense against predators. This is the driver for primates anyway, but probably also for ungulates, is you can either have very big chaotic groups, which is what ungulates do, on the basis of no brain at all, or you have these very bonded groups, which is what you have, tightly bonded groups where, if you like, people look out for each other within the group and help protect each other. And those are sort of two diverging things. Now, we've shown, at least we've shown with a computational model, that the cognitive demands of large-scale groupings of that kind are hugely costly. What we did was use processor time, basically, in the computations as a measure of brain demand, if you like. And it's clear that there are basically two strategies. You can either have a very cheap and cheerful thing, but it limits your group size if you're going to have bonded groups enormously, or you've got to invest heavily in this. I would point out vis-a-vis insects. Insects solve this problem chemically. I mean, that's primarily how they do it, of course. But I would point out that there's this whole tranche of studies now showing that in a number of species, they're mostly wasps of various kinds. I think that in social species have bigger, whichever neuron it is, somewhere that handles social stuff, than solitary species. And within social species, I think it is queens have bigger neurons than, there's another effect, similar effect. In other words, there is a cost. No, they're kind of going down the same mammalian route, that where they need to try and work socially, they're being willing to pay the cost. But of course, unlike mammals or what have you, they have a body weight issue about flight, so they can't have enormous brains, I suppose, which ultimately then limits them. But, sorry, long answer to a short question. That was lecture 3, if you want it.
I guess I didn't get the way that you get or you define these discrete layers of numbers of contacts. I understand the 1.5 part,
right.
But then are they really the next ones, like 4, 15, 45 and such? Are they discrete for particular individuals, or are they discrete at the population level, or are they just what are they actually?
We define them in personal networks on the basis of interaction frequencies or on this measure of emotional closeness, and both measures seem to work. Both seem to show quite discrete jumps between the layers. So if you plot the emotional closeness, let's say, or the contact frequencies between layers, you don't have a completely smooth decay function, right, across, or if you're just ranking it, all the individuals out. It jumps, and it jumps at the boundaries. But this is why we did the fractal analysis, because it was simply looking at, if you like, the distribution of grouping sizes that you see. And you see this very clearly, these very discrete layers, and particularly in the grouping sizes of traditional small-scale societies. They really are there. I mean, they're physically there in the environment. So the smallest layer is the camp group of can be around about 30, 35, up to 50, but that's the sort of essentially 50 layer. That's what you see sleeping together around a fire as a camp group. And they form part of a clan grouping, which then has a very discrete social connotation in their minds. It meets together once a year or so for puberty rituals. You don't go and join a camp group from another clan, you only join camp groups from your clan. The next layer out consists of several clans, again with a defined exchange relationships, usually in terms of the extent to which you can go and use other people's resources in times of hardship. So when you've got famine, you can go in that 500 layer, and which gives you a very long range. I mean, we're talking about 100,000 square kilometers of space to trade into, if you like. And the outer layer, the 1500, is the average size of tribes, which is a linguistic unit. It's defined as all the people that speak the same language. So they have, those layers are well known, actually, in the anthropological literature. They just never notice the numbers because they don't count, usually. I mean, anthropologists are not quantitative, right?
Yeah, but you are saying that also in our modern society,
Yep.
if you look at the numbers of contacts that people have or the intensity of them, that you still get this
Yes,
discrete...
yes, yeah. That's what comes out of our network.
There was one quick one, and then we have to move on.
I have a question, comment, in a sense. The first thing you said is that new technologies haven't changed the Dunbar number.
Yep.
But that was not really a surprise to me, in a sense that these new technologies are a very recent event in human history. So clearly we have reached our state of brain configuration to maximize the social interactions with a face-to-face communication. In a sense, when could we expect for these structural change in communications to have an effect on evolution itself? So when somehow can we imagine that these new technologies will cause some sort of adaptation for our brain?
Yep. So I suppose I might have pointed out that you can have more people on Facebook than 150 people do, but actually all you're doing is spilling out into the next layer out, what we would call the 500 layer, right? In other words, currently the technology doesn't really allow you to do anything that you couldn't already do in real life. I mean, these are people we would call acquaintances. And they're clearly still also acquaintances on Facebook. They're not people you would normally interact with. They're kind of forced on you a little bit as friends of friends in the way Facebook does. So the question then is really that the interest in the technology like Facebook is really, can it cut through the constraints that operate on, that limit us to these numbers, or this series of numbers? And there's no reason why it shouldn't have done, because if the constraint was a pure time constraint, and the technology allows you to talk to 20 different people at the same time, then it could have increased your social circle enormously as a result, because in effect that's all these mechanisms I ended up with, really trying to point out that we have used technology, if you like, in the form of laughter, music and so on, of a clunky kind to increase the size of our networks. We've actually done that. And they've cut through specific kinds of constraints. And I suppose the point to highlight there is that constraint is this emotional constraint. And this goes back to the fact that in reality, relationships have this intense emotional quality for us, which is very difficult for us to quantify. And that's probably the root problem. It's not entirely a memory problem. So, yes, Facebook can remind you of somebody's birthday or what have you, or keep a record of other people's doings that you can check up on, but that's not really the problem that's limiting the number of relationships you can have. It's not entirely a time constraint problem. It is about the number of people you can interact with, but it's interacting with in a certain specific kind of way, and this is why where the endorphin story seems to be so critical. That seems to underpin the whole thing. So in a slightly more than tongue-in-cheek way, I think the answer really does lie in the technology finding ways of expanding the number of people you can create these endorphin hits with. I still worry that actually what Facebook does is slow down the rate of decrease in relationship quality. It won't stop it declining completely. In other words, at some point you have to see the whites of their eyes, otherwise that relationship will just drop off the end. The only thing that holds it up seems to be real interaction. Of course, all these other mechanisms, laughter, music and so on, are all intensely social. You're doing it with people there. So the question is, can we do virtual reality of a kind, which is so good that we feel we're in this much bigger grouping in some sense? I mean, those are the challenges for the techies, I think.
For one, to the Science Institute, secondly, maybe to the university and funding agencies, how should they kind of support, facilitate this kind of research, and maybe thirdly, for the researchers themselves. So if you are interested in going in a kind of or excited about some multidisciplinary direction, so what can you expect and what pitfalls should you avoid?